Thanks for everyone for joining us today. I would just like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting from today, and also the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, where Kate is joining us from today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today, also paying my respects to your elders past, present and emerging as well. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Kate Dinon. I'm the Managing Director of Character and Distinction, a public relations agency that predominantly works with tech companies based in Melbourne, and also a StartMate mentor, and also now an interviewer, apparently.
As of right now.
As of today. And the wonderful, wonderful woman on screen with me is Kate Morris. Kate is an incredible entrepreneur and founder and now Chief Innovation Officer of Adore Beauty, Australia's first beauty e-commerce site that she started at the tender age of 21 with just $12,000 and a couple of little-known cosmetic brands on board, which, of course, everyone knows the Adore Beauty of today, which has grown to stock pretty much all the best things that you can possibly get your hands on, through to an IPO just a few months ago. Some things you might not know about Kate: she's a foodie, she loves shoes, the musical Hamilton, so please feel free to get any questions about any of those things in as well. And she can't say no to champagne or pastry.
And why would you?
And exactly. So you might have heard Kate tell her story before, potentially, but today you're going to hear a lot of things you haven't heard from Kate before about being a founder, about Kate's journey, and anything else you guys want to ask at the end as well. So I will hand over to Kate and let her tell you her story before we jump into the Q&A.
Thanks, Kate. My fellow champagne and Hamel fan. I'll give everybody sort of the short dish version of Adore Beauty, because there's that many podcasts if you want to hear the longer version. But look, it's kind of the classic cliche, maybe garage startup story. So I was a uni student still and working on the clearance counter. They used to send me around to different stores wearing dorky red shoes and a white kind of karate belt dress. And I'd always loved beauty. For me, that it was one of those things that if you were having a bit of a lousy day or you felt just a bit sort of subpar generally, if you gave yourself a nice little facial at home or put a fresh lipstick on, that I found it would always help to lift my mood and make me feel a bit more confident. But I think one of the things that I got to understand from serving a lot of customers at the counter was that in terms of the shopping experience, most customers did not find it particularly empowering or confidence-inducing, and they actually found it quite intimidating and pretty unpleasant. And to me, that just didn't really make a lot of sense. So this was the very, very, very early kind of pre-first .com bubble days. There was no online, or there were hardly any online stores, full stop, in Australia. There was nothing online for beauty. And for me, it was just, okay, well, someone's going to need to start an online beauty store, because I really think a lot of people are going to prefer to shop that way. And I kind of waited for a little while and bored all my friends stupid with, going on about this idea for an online beauty store all the time until my boyfriend said to me one day, he said, look, are you going to do this or what? And so that was my entrepreneurial light bulb moment. That's the first time I'd ever considered it. So yes, borrowed $12,000 from his dad and got started in the garage. And it was basically just a really long and slow slog for a really long time. I get asked this question a lot. It's like, oh, when did it all really start taking off? And, was there a moment? And no, not really. No, it was just slogging it for many, many years, and getting knocked back by lots of the beauty brands that we approached, because none of them were the least bit interested in having their business model disrupted by some 21-year-old who had, no experience and didn't know what she was doing. And so one by one, just a matter of convincing them over a period of many years, and convincing customers too, actually, because it was so early on in the online shopping piece that a big part of what I felt like I was doing in those early days was actually just explaining to people why you would want to buy things on the internet, just kind of full stop, which now, of course, it seems like a no-brainer and doesn't sound especially disruptive. At the time, it definitely was. And I think really the most disruptive thing about what we were doing was putting customers in charge of the shopping experience, which is a very big thing in beauty and actually kind of still is. Taking away all of those barriers for the customer in terms of being able to shop between different brands and being allowed to just, buy the products that you liked from each, and having all of the information at your fingertips and being able to make your own decisions rather than being treated like a student or like a patient and having to ask for permission to buy the products that you wanted. And also too, and this is still really the thing for Adore today, is being allowed to engage with the beauty category on whatever level makes you feel good. So, if you want to just wear sunscreen, you don't really want to do makeup, from my perspective, then you don't have to. But that's, in the beauty industry, it's actually quite, almost heresy to say that you should be allowed to do or not do whatever makes you feel good. But look, bootstrapped for a really long time, ended up doing our first equity raise 14 years in. So we actually raised some strategic money from Woolworths, bought it back 2 years later, went it solo again for a little while, sold 60% to Quadrant Private Equity in 2019, and then had all of our plans fast forwarded by COVID, and ended up listing in October, and we're now enjoying the turbulent and interesting waters of public markets. And along the way, also started a SaaS business called Foundation that's also still going and is working with a whole bunch of global retailers, and that's actually had a really massive year during COVID as well.
Okay, there's a lot to There's a lot to talk about there. It just strikes me that in 1999, when you started Adore, things like this weren't around, I imagine. Like the resources that are available for founders now through things like StartMate and all the other programs. And
this conversation that we are having right now would just not have happened. It was just me by myself in a garage.
I was going to ask, was there a community around you at the time? Or was it really just you working on your idea?
Pretty much, yeah. I knew one other person who had started a lingerie website called Zodi in her garage. So she'd started a year before me, and we just used to sit there on, MSN Messenger, just kind of keeping each other company during the day. But no, it was pretty grim and pretty depressing, actually. I think, being a founder is kind of a lonely gig as it is, but there's so much more, just network and support around today, which is a really good thing.
Yeah, and people that have trodden the path like you coming back and helping others.
Right. And hopefully people just sharing that that's kind of normal for it to be really hard. Yeah. I think that's the thing, is that because if all you did was read the newspapers, you would think, oh my goodness, I must be doing something very wrong, because it's hard and there are problems all the time and I don't know what to do next and we're running out of money. And so if all you saw was sort of glossy, newspaper stories, you would think, oh goodness, I'm clearly, I should chuck it in because everybody else is doing way better than me, which is not the truth.
Yeah, looks like everyone's succeeding. Yeah, we'll go into that. There's a question actually that's come up that I think is kind of relevant to where we're at, from Michael Bergen. He says he'd love to hear about how you solved the chicken and egg problem with your marketplace. How many products and suppliers did you have listed before you launched?
We had 2 before we launched, which was certainly not anywhere near enough. But the problem that I was running into was that everybody, all of the brands that I was approaching wanted to see what traction we had and what the website was going to look like. Because bear in mind, like, nobody really had any concept of what I was even talking about back then. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to get it built so that then at least I can show people. And so I thought, okay, what's the minimum number I will need to actually just get some kind of functioning product? So yes, that was my MVP, was 2 brands and no customers. And so went back to all of the brands, and then so I had 2, and then I think 5 more said yes once I actually had something to show them. And so then we had 7, and then you just go back to everybody again. But yeah, definitely is that whole sort of two-sided marketplace problem where you can't get the customers unless you have the brands. You can't get the brands unless you have the customers, and you just have to try and sort of inch it up side by side for a long time with no money. Yeah.
You and I were talking to Alex, the founder of Milk Drop, about this the other day, about getting to your first 50 sales. Do you remember how long it took you to get to your first 50 sales?
Oh God, no. Well, look, considering at that point, in the very early days, I was getting I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 a week. So it probably took months. I don't know. It was mostly family members who felt sorry for me making their first online purchases.
Oh, thank you, Kate. I'll jump back to the questions that I've got planned, but I'm going to keep my eye on the Q&A tab mostly. So if anyone wants questions, please pop them in there. I'm going to talk about being principled. You're someone who's very principled from my perspective. I'd love to hear what your guiding principles are in life and where they came from.
Oh gosh, look, I probably don't think of myself as being principled. I mean, to me, that kind of, it sounds like maybe a bit judgy. It's like, I've got principles, and I probably think about it more in the sense of that I try and live by my values, which are, fairly reflective of Adore's values, to be honest, and they weren't something that I'd ever really particularly enunciated for myself up until the time that we went through that process of working them out for Adore. And even that process basically, came through pain. So it was the year that we kind of doubled our team from 12 to maybe 25 in the space of 12 months. And when you're growing that fast, you can make some hasty hires. And we had a few just sort of interpersonal clashes, which in the end, it turned out to be sort of values clashes, really. And it made a horrible mess. And in the aftermath of that, we all sat around as a team and just went, right, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Because I don't think any of us enjoyed this. It was just a horrible place to work for a little while. And so we went through a process with the team. And so what we came out with was a list of 4 values. And when I say values, I mean, I guess sort of decision-making tools on a day-to-day basis. I think some companies use values as a thing that you sort of stick on the wall and then, kind of forget about it, and nobody could name them. But anyone that knows Adore knows that we bang on about them incessantly. So the first one of those is doing the right thing, which kind of sounds like everyone's like, oh, yeah, doing the right thing. It's like, yeah, no, but when it hurts, or when it's embarrassing, or when it means that maybe you don't win as much as you could have, it's sort of, possibly giving up short-term gain sometimes for overall long-term trust, and just for sort of being a better force on, the world and society generally. Growing is number 2, and so that means we used to call this one courage to fail, and then I think it was sort of perhaps not quite positive enough, but basically it kind of means the same thing, like being allowed to try different things and being allowed to make mistakes so long as you're learning from them, and also pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. And that's something that I have to remind myself often when I'm, feeling a bit nauseous from fear. I can think, the day of ringing the IPO bell, I was just sitting there thinking, oh, I'm going to throw up. I thought, no, we're growing, we're learning. Pitching in is number 3. So working for each other and making sure that, nobody is too special to unstack the dishwasher when it's their turn in the kitchen, and if you can see people in other teams who are, struggling or they're underwater, do you have a minute? Can you give them a hand? And that's very much something we live by at Adora. It's kind of a bit non-hierarchical in that way. I had someone try and convince me to sort of take a reserved car space, and I went, oh, no. No, I'm good. That's all right. If I get there late, then I'll park around the corner. And having a positive approach is number 4. And what that means, it doesn't mean being Pollyanna all the time. What it does mean is coming with your best assumptions, just about people in particular, and it's a bit of a Brene Brown thing. I love Brene, and one of the things she says is, what if everybody is actually just doing their best? And so a positive approach means, okay, let's start from the assumption that everybody is just doing their best, and it doesn't mean we don't have boundaries, but can we? And it's useful. I mean, if I think about it, in terms of working with sort of behavioural issues that you might come across in your team, or working with your suppliers if someone is acting a particular way where you want to get cross with them, and if you can stop yourself just for a minute and take a breath and going, okay, I don't know all of the things that are going on in this person's life, and maybe if I did, I would understand better why that's happening. And given that I don't know all of that, how can I create, a positive resolution to this situation? Which is very useful if you're in a customer service business, I have to say, because sometimes there are responses that don't seem very rational at the time, but our approach is always, hey, look, we can fix this for you. It will be okay. And then most of the time people do say, oh, yeah, thank you for that. Sorry, I got a bit sweary on the phone. Yes, thank you. There's always something else going on. And so yes, I feel like if we, and these were the values that we came up with, that, okay, when everything is working really well and it feels good, what are the behaviours that we can see in evidence there, and what are the decisions that help us, if we continue to live by our values, does this continue to reinforce our culture? And I think that's been a really key part of us being able to scale the business. And as a mentor, when I work with mentees, this is one of the pieces of work that you have to do at some point in any growth organisation, and you can put it off, but at some point you will have to do it. This is and you can do it through pain, as we did, or you can get ahead of it and try and get it in first.
It's so interesting to me that yours came from the back of maybe some wrong hires in hindsight. Do you think it would have been possible to do the values to the same kind of, or to have done them?
It would have worked.
Yeah. Do you think sometimes you don't know until you?
Maybe. I think it's certainly, obviously sometimes it's an easier way to work out what you do want by having experienced what you don't want. But I mean, I don't know. I haven't done it both ways. I think if I were building another company again from scratch, I would certainly look to get on top of it sooner rather than later, because I think it helps so much with hiring and all of that kind of thing to get people who are aligned and are happy to make decisions in a similar way.
It's they strike me as, when I hear you say, I haven't heard those values before, but that's pretty much how I would describe you as well. That makes sense. Yeah. But it's interesting, as a founder-led business, the values, how much they reflect you versus how much they reflect the business.
Yeah.
It's not really a question, more of an observation.
Well, I guess, yeah, if you're trying to build an organisation with a strong culture, everybody always says culture comes from the top, right? So I think it makes sense. I think in any organisation, the culture will tend to reflect the values of the leadership. So for us, that was why hiring a CEO was such a big deal and took us a long time, because if you're I mean, that can make the biggest mess, I think, if you put in someone with different values at the top, and all of a sudden it kind of, shakes the foundations, I think, that everything is built on. So that was a really key bit of it. There's
a good question about values actually that's come up. It's just weird, so I'll grab it back. Just about investors and how much investors have influenced Adore's values. It seems that you have had integral values as you've grown. So keen to understand whether any of this changed as investors came in. I guess maybe whether any of the values have ever been challenged in that regard.
No, they haven't, but only because we decided that was this. Like for us, that's the hard boundary. Is changing our values, and a smart investor will understand that culture and values is part of what got an organisation to where it is. So unless there is a cultural problem, then you would not want to go in and start mucking with the values. But it was certainly something that was definitely at the front of my mind when I made those decisions. So, and I'm thinking about, Quadrant particularly, because they were coming in and buying a majority share. Like I did a lot of diligence around that. And they first gave me a list of maybe 3 or 4 founders to speak to, and I spoke to every single one of them, and I said, yes, who else have you got? Send me some more. And they're like, oh, okay. So they sent me another 4, and I phoned all of those, and I said, yes, okay, who else have you got? Because I wanted to make really sure. And they've always been very supportive of our values, and so it's not ever been a problem. And even when they're, there's sometimes discussions where you would say, hey, or where they might say, hey, why don't you do X, Y, Z? And we would say, we're not going to do that because that would, be against our values in this particular way. And so no, we're not going to do that. And I'd say, okay.
Well, I guess they accepted that these were your hard boundaries from the beginning as well.
Correct. Yeah. So that was part of the discussion from the beginning. I mean, obviously we're in a very different situation now, because it's the whole point of being a listed business is that you do not get to choose your investors, which is really interesting. And I did have, more than one person say to me, oh, well, now that you're listed, you're going to have to change your values. And I said, absolutely not. And I don't understand why anybody would want us to. And I mean, we went as far as, putting the values right in the founder's letter at the very front of the prospectus, because from my perspective, it is important. And I went through them in every single, in every single pitch that we did. And I did, oh God, I don't know, 60 in the first roadshow. Like every single one of them, we went through what our values were, because if anybody has like a particular issue with any one of them, just, this is who we are, and you buy in on that basis or don't. Either is okay, but you need to understand that this is how we are going to do things, because we believe that this is in the long-term best interests of the company, and so this is important. And it doesn't mean that. And the difficult thing I think about values is that sometimes they do, to live by your values does sometimes give short-term pain. But I always think that if you take a long-term view, it's the correct decision. And I think of an example. So, I mean, one of ours, doing the right thing, for instance, at the start of COVID, so it was, I don't know, March or April or whatever, when everything was going crazy and people were panic buying toilet paper, and our sales had tripled overnight, and it was just insane. And someone had made the comment that, oh, well, we're in a pretty good negotiating position with our suppliers, if we wanted to kind of push anybody for extra, payment terms or that kind of thing, because we were sort of the only channel to market. And I said, no, we're not going to do that, because that would not be the right thing to do. And actually, particularly for some of our smaller suppliers who, this is kind of pre-JobKeeper, who are struggling to keep the lights on and keep all their people paid, can we just reach out to them and see if they're okay, and maybe actually we pay them early, so that they can afford to, to pay their teams. And I think, if you do that consistently, then that is a thing that builds trust. And trust, I think, is the basis of everything.
Yep. Trust and goodwill. I think that's, so there's another question about, one more question on values, if that's okay, and then I'll jump into the next bit. But can you give us an example of where you've brought the values to life and translated that directly to the customer, like whether it's through a product or whether it's through something that you've done?
Sure. Look, I think our recent Global Shades campaign is a really pretty good example of that for anyone who's not familiar with it. Basically came from a moment that I'm not especially proud of, but a few years ago, someone who'd been in our marketing team for, I don't know, 5 years or something, sort of came to me. I think she actually wrote me an email and said, look, I need you to know this, but, all this time I've been working at Adore, I haven't been able to buy my foundation here because we don't carry my shade. Because at the time we'd made, just based on being a bootstrapped business and always short of cash, that with any products that had like a large number of SKUs, so some lipsticks for instance would come in 30 different colors, we would only ever carry say the top 10 or top 12. And of course what we were doing when it came to foundation was excluding the full shade range, and just massive blind spot for me, and I just hadn't realized. And we had that conversation and I felt very deeply ashamed and went, right, how are we going to fix it? And so started by, okay, first of all, we can just order in all of the shades that we don't have. We can start there, and that took a little while because we had to make sure that we had enough cash to be able to do that, and then went through a process of working with our suppliers, who some of whom just still carried quite a narrow shade range. And so even though we were carrying all of the shades that were available in Australia, we still didn't have enough to cater for everybody's actual color. And so working with our suppliers and saying, hey, we really want to make sure that everybody can buy their shade from us. Can you get these other shades in that you have internationally? And some of them were able to do that, and others it was like, okay, well, yeah, we can, but you'd have to buy like more than we could ever sell in the actual sort of shelf life of the product. You're going to have to buy like thousands of these for us to get it in. And so that was the point where we realized that, okay, so look, we've already extended our shade range beyond kind of where pretty much every other retailer has, and we could sort of sit there on that as our competitive advantage, but kind of doesn't really solve the underlying problem, in the sense that there are people who have been excluded from the definition of beauty, and that's not really okay. And so yes, it was more about, okay, right, well, how can we actually solve that sort of broader issue? And so that's where the sort of the Global Shades campaign came up, to highlight an issue that a lot of people like me weren't aware of, and to basically demonstrate to the industry the support for extending shade ranges, not just on the Adore platform, but more generally in the industry. And we just had such a hugely positive response to it, and anecdotally are hearing from some of our suppliers that it is leading to the change that we hoped for. So it's really exciting.
So great to hear.
Yeah.
So the response to Global Shades from customers, have you been tracking that in any way, or is it really mainly through sales?
Yeah, no, it's been through social. We've been gathering signatures through a petition to just kind of demonstrate the demand for it, and yes, have had so many women of colour come to us and say, hey, thank you for using your platform to talk about it. It is, of course, only one category, and there's a whole bunch of other conversations that also need to be had. I mean, sunscreen is a really good one, for instance. A lot of sunscreens turn like purple on, on darker skin tones, hair product, lipsticks. What's a nude lipstick? There's still a long ways to go with it, but it's, I feel like, progress is better than perfection. And, I think, you got to kind of start the conversation and get the awareness out there.
I think that the way that all came about and how honest you are about that is really amazing. I definitely think of Adore as the most inclusive kind of beauty, and whatever that means for you, which I think is such a nice way to frame it.
Yeah. Look, I still kind of feel like we're at the start of that journey, but there's more to do.
Kate, there are so many questions, so I'm going to scrap our conversation doors because we don't need them. I'm just going to.
There they go. All that work.
I know. But there's some really great, like much better than my questions. There's some great questions here, so let's jump into them. So this is from Natalia Hodgkins, who's the founder of Her Health. Thanks, Kate. She says, as a young female founder, did you come up against barriers, particularly early on, that you felt were linked to your gender? If yes, do you have any advice as to how you worked around this or turned it to your advantage?
Oh, look, so many of them are structural. I did not, fortunately, have the really horrible sort of VC experiences that I've heard from some founders in the States and elsewhere, like just horrendous things. So I didn't have any of that. So I feel fortunate in that regard. I guess the flip side of that was that nobody was the least bit interested in my business from a capital raising perspective, and so I just had to bootstrap the whole thing because nobody would have lent me any money. So I guess that's sort of the bigger structural issue that I came up against. And I guess I think things are getting better. I think they're getting better. Maybe at the sort of the earlier funding stages, like still by the time you get up to private equity and then, fund managers for like listed stocks, it's bad. Even just on a gender standpoint, like before you even get to anything else. Look, I think one of the things that can be most difficult for women is that typically we don't like confident and ambitious women. We like women to be humble, and kind and all of those things. And then you go and try and, and realistic, and then you go and try and raise money, and that's interpreted as being, as being less competent, and which is not our fault. So I don't subscribe to anything that says that we need to fix women. I think women are perfectly fine. I think what we actually need to do is to really help to broaden and diversify the investor base so that people understand that women present differently and that they understand businesses that have been built for women and to solve women's problems. Because I'm coming up against a lot of that still, where I'm having to explain the beauty industry to people who have no idea and think that skincare is a discretionary purchase, which, as we all know, it is certainly not. I'm wary of giving tips for women because there is nothing wrong with you. It's the system that is broken. That said, if you are confident and ambitious, then don't be afraid to be that. That is okay. And understand that, in a world where most of what people are seeing is male founders who do present with more confidence and ambition, everybody will kind of automatically discount what a founder, puts forward in terms of their ambition. They go, okay, yeah, well, that's not true, but so I'm just going to discount that by 30%. But be aware that that's what's happening. So if you're putting forward numbers that you can hit, those will be discounted by sort of like a confidence inflation. So if you want to inflate them first to sort of, factor that in, then go for it. Personally, I just put forward numbers that I can hit and express my confidence in that these are my numbers and I will be hitting the numbers. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have a track record of having hit numbers for a long time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kate. Allow me to just find the next most top rated. Are there any plans to expand Adore Beauty globally?
World domination. Well, look, maybe if I tell you a little bit about the CEO that I hired, and you can make your own judgments. But Tennille O'Shannessy has come from 10 years at Seek, which is a global digital employment marketplace. We did not pick anyone from beauty or from retail because we want someone who thinks disruptively and without assumptions about how things already work. Tennille led their international strategy for 3 years and then spent another 3 years actually leading the Americas division of Seek, which was Mexico and Brazil. And yes, we're very happy with that experience set. So we already expanded to New Zealand. Really interesting thing is that lots of our content attracts visitors from all over the world just organically. So, I mean, our podcast, I was looking the other day and our podcast was like number 3 in Slovakia. You know, it's in English. We never promoted it there. It's just, and so I think, yes, when you build good content that people enjoy and that adds value in that way, that kind of, attracts people organically.
That's really interesting. There's actually a great question that's linked to that. Which is from Tara Teague, founder of Mamaco. I want to know what all these businesses are.
I know. I have to look them all up afterwards.
She says, hey, Kate, you obviously launched well before social media being the beast it is today. Not that far before. So can you let us know what was your secret sauce in creating brand awareness and educating potential customers on a new concept? And then maybe we can talk a bit about the podcast and ways of doing that now as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like talking about what I did back then is sort of almost irrelevant because everything's changed. So if you think I started like pre-Google, pre-Facebook, pre-smartphone, like practically everything was on like stone tablets. I had to crawl under my desk and unplug the modem to plug my phone back in. Like it was just very different. So I did a lot of PR. Of course, I'm speaking to the expert here in terms of what PR can do to build brand awareness. What else did I do? I mean, I tried to build trust among a customer base by just sort of hanging out. I mean, sort of the precursor to social media was news groups, Usenet news groups. And so I used to hang out on like alt.fashion and help people with their skincare questions, just like being helpful, not talking about product or anything like that. And sort of built up a little bit of a reputation there, a bit of an expert profile. But mostly what I tried to do was to just make the customer experience really great, so that if we did get a customer, that they would go, oh, well, this is great. Like, I'm not shopping any other way from now on. I'm just going to do this. This is fantastic. And also, hopefully, tell one person about it. And so that was actually where the Tim Tam came from, was to just have that moment of surprise and delight when you opened your order, and that would, give you that good feeling of, they sent me a treat. And in the hope that maybe someone might open it, like if they were in an office, and they might tell somebody.
I remember the first time I ever bought from Adore was well before I knew you. And I remember getting that Tim Tam and wondering if it was an accident and whether it was safe to eat. But I ate it because I was like, why is there a Tim Tam?
You ate it?
I ate it. Of course I ate it. I always eat them.
That's funny.
Yeah. And what about the podcast? Like, how do you think about finding new customers now? Is that part of what the podcast is about?
A little bit, yeah. It's about, I mean, and particularly sort of in the early days of social media, I saw a lot of businesses build very strong profiles. It used to be a thing, like how many likes your page had on Facebook, or even nowadays, how many followers do you have on Instagram, which to me, I don't know, I kind of always had the heebies about that, because I was like, yeah, you don't own that platform. Like right now it looks like a really great source of free customers, but soon that's not going to be free. And if you haven't bothered to sort of build an email list or anything like that, or any kind of direct connection with your site, then that's going to be really hard when they make you start paying for it. And sure enough, that's what happened. So I guess the content strategy for Adore was something that we experimented with for a really long time and started investing more heavily in 2016. And it started with our blog, with our Beauty IQ blog, which is still going and still powers a lot of our content, but then also just experimenting with other different styles of content. So it took us ages to get the blog right, even to get something that was interesting enough that customers would repeatedly engage with it, and that would also not just, because of course we were looking for retail enabled content. So it was all well and good if someone read something, but no good if they came and read it and immediately left and bought nothing. And so we had to try and
trying to build a publishing empire.
Well, that's it. And then just started experimenting with different forms of content. And so yes, on social was a good place to experiment with that, because you could see reasonably quickly whether or not people liked it and engaged with it. And we still do create a lot of content for social, but also again, going back to thinking about what channels could we own. And yes, it was actually kind of happened organically. So, well, organically, when I say organically, obviously there's all of the, the many, many years of building this sort of culture where things like this can happen. But a couple of people in the marketing team said, hey, we really want to do a podcast. Can we have some money to do a podcast? We want to give it a try. And we said, all right, how much do you need? $12,000. Well, you can't have $12,000. You can have $2,000. Go. And they came up with the first 3 episodes, and I listened to the pilot episodes, and the first of them, go and listen to the first episode of Beauty IQ, and this is the very first episode of the podcast that I ever heard, and it talks about hair removal from sensitive areas in, great detail. And I thought, well, people are either going to love this or they're going to hate it. And it turns out they loved it. So it's been going on since then. Is that me or is that you?
That was me. I'm so sorry. But I didn't know that's how the podcast came about. That's such a great.
Yeah.
So it's not like, hey, we need a podcast, go make one. It's actually the marketing team saying.
It's the team saying, hey, we think we could, and they came up with the format, which, for Beauty IQ Uncensored, which is our first podcast, so that passed 2 million downloads this year, which I think is actually extraordinary, to be honest. And when I think about it, because you can't pay anybody to download a podcast and listen to it. Like you can make
really have to, and you have to really want to do it.
You have to really want to do it. You have to really want to do it, because you can force somebody to watch like a YouTube pre-roll or something, but you cannot make anybody listen to a podcast. And so it just had to be interesting enough, and people needed to be entertained. So it was educational entertainment was kind of how we thought of that one. We have a second podcast as well, which has just sort of completed its initial season, so that's Skincare School. So this is which is much more on the education side of things, because we had a lot of customers saying, oh, look, I like that, Beauty IQ, it's very fun and feels like a chat between girlfriends, but actually I just want somebody to explain skincare to me. Like, could you I don't need all of the talk about, dating or laser hair removal. Like, it just explain the skincare part. And so that was.
This is you going back to your, I know it's not you during the podcast, this is you going back to your news groups discussions and just being like answering people's skincare questions.
It's the same as it ever was. What we actually want is to give our customers that feeling of confidence by feeling like they understand the products that they're buying, and they know what they're going to do and what they're not going to do, and they don't feel pushed or bullied into anything, because they're the ones calling the shots. They've got all the information and they can make the decisions. Yeah.
Thank you. Rupa Chopra has asked, the founder of the Raw Vedic, Hi, Kate. Your personal profiling has been fantastic. What would you recommend for founders who do have an authentic story but are relatively new to the industry and thus may be overlooked?
Look, it did not happen overnight, shall we say. I have been doing this for 21 years. So, pick a lane and go hard on it. And the thing that I will say is that you'll need to get over right now being squeamish about telling your story and promoting yourself. I am a absolutely shameless self-promoter, and because I need to be, because that's my job. And I see a lot of people going, oh yeah, I don't really feel comfortable, talking about myself. It's like, well, I didn't either. But I've had to bully myself into getting used to it. And one of the techniques that I find useful that I often share with mentees is that if you can create a persona for yourself. I mean, Beyonce is Sasha Fierce when she's on stage. Whoever you need to be to go and be able to do that, if it helps to think about playing a part. Hi, today I'm going to be playing the part of the inspirational skincare founder. Then do that. But you're going to need to get over it, and it's very difficult because it's not a very Australian thing to get out there and talk yourself up, and it's particularly hard for women, I think, because we get that squished out of it at a fairly young age. So you'll just need to find it and bring it out. And yes, it will make you feel quite uncomfortable and squirmy, and I do still quite regularly feel uncomfortable and squirmy, but you're just going to be able to push that to the side because your founder story is one of the most valuable things that you have.
Yeah, and that's the thing about founders is they all have such incredible stories about how they've come to be solving the problem that they're solving.
Yeah,
and I have a lot of women friends as well who say, oh, but I'm not interesting enough, or my story is not interesting enough. Do I have to make it up? Again, just back to the chat we were having with one of the founders we both know the other day, and she was telling us some hilarious stories about starting her company that would make the best
stories.
Yeah, and so everyone will have those. It's just a matter of figuring out what they are.
That's it. And getting used to telling them too, and the more you practice, the better you get at it.
Yeah. Yeah, how many times do you reckon you've told your story, Kate?
Oh, thousands. I try and change it up though, like just emphasize more bits of one, just so that I don't get bored. Otherwise, I feel like I'm like an automaton.
No, you do it very, very well. Okay, so there's a few more questions. We're going to jump around a little bit on topics here. Oh, no, that one's been removed. Hang on. What are the things that keep you up at night, Kate?
What are the things that keep me up at night? I still always find people problems are the most difficult and stress me out the most. I think, people problems are always the hardest. I think like most people, I don't like to be disliked, and I always kind of worry about sort of how sociopathic the people are who are like, oh yeah, I don't care who likes me and who doesn't. It's like, as if you don't. So it's difficult. I mean, times when you have to make decisions that might be the right decision, but maybe there will be people who are not going to like it. That can be hard.
Yeah.
And I think also too, the only things that will give me sleepless nights usually is if I feel like I have not behaved within my values. I will beat myself up for that a lot. So it's just, it's fun, as we all do, to just revisit all the ways in which you've failed yourself at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'll be like, is this a really good time to be having this conversation with myself? Could we maybe talk about this in the morning? Yeah.
Natalie Raffay, founder of Splash Up, has asked, how did you manage bootstrapping and meeting the required costs of business in the early days until your first fundraise?
Discipline. And look, I guess that is the good thing about bootstrapping, is that it forces you to find a business model that works, because there's no alternative, because if it doesn't work, you don't eat. And as it was, I lived very, very cheaply for a very long time. I call those the meagering years. Those little Indomie packet noodles.
I love those.
They have zero nutritional.
Not if that's all you're eating, yeah.
No. Yeah, you need a vegetable. Yeah. So look, I mean, that was sort of the stage that I realised that I really did need to understand the numbers myself, and I think that was one of the areas that always made me quite nervous, and I sort of always hoped that if we had an accountant that I wouldn't have to understand it. And no, you do need to understand the numbers, and when, particularly if you're trying to grow a business, the profitability is never going to be as high, but to understand where the lines are. But there were times, I mean, don't get me wrong, there were times, particularly when we were trying to grow faster, and that meant that we sort of took some risks in the sense of making investments that we knew were going to grow the business, or we believed were going to grow the business, but that we weren't kind of going to get the upside of immediately. And that was a scary time, because we were basically, we should have probably, I mean, typically if we'd had access to capital, we would have been in cash burn at that point just to sort of get over a particular hump, but we didn't have that option. And so we had to just kind of manage profitability on a knife edge. And there were numerous times where my co-founder, James, would sort of come and say to me, go and sit in the car, because we were in an open plan office, and so you couldn't have these conversations publicly. And so we'd go and sit in the car, and he'd go, I think it's all over. I think it's all over. I don't see how we're going to make payroll next week. And we'd sort of sit there in the car and we'd cry for a little bit and just go, all right, what do we got? We would have the most massive brainstorming sessions with the team when we got back, without having, of course, shared our more sort of existential concerns. But and to just go, okay, right, what can we pull out that might get us another 50 grand in sales this week?
So you took bootstrapping like to its absolute
extreme levels. Yeah, no, I don't recommend it. That was really quite frightening, and we'd already remortgaged our house another couple of times to do that. And so it was like, that was the knife edge where it's like, okay, like in terms of it being all over, it would have been all over.
That is incredible.
Oh, I can't recommend it. It was not fun. It was just, I mean, capital raising just took, so that was when we were in the middle of a cap raise, and it just took way longer than I thought that it was going to. And so we kind of needed it to be done in 6 months, and it took 14 months.
Oh. And I guess you don't want to be in that position when you're raising either, because you don't want to be forced into.
No, well, and this is a really good thing for any founders watching to understand, is that if you think you're going to need money, like start raising like well before you actually need it, because to be in that, it's not a good negotiating position to be in for a start, but also it's extraordinarily stressful.
Especially because they have access to your financials, right? So they know where you are.
They know. They know exactly how much of the barrel you're over. So, yeah, it's not great.
I bet you're get pretty nervous if James ever asked you to have a chat in the car now.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that it's 1:56. So do you think we can squeeze in one more?
I think we can squeeze in one more.
Okay. Oh, I don't know if you'll be able to answer it quick enough. Do you have a favourite failure? There's a bit of a setup to the question. Oh. As an early stage startup founder, one occasionally deals with temporary failure, which maybe is kind of what we were talking about. How has a failure or an apparent failure set you up for this big success later? Do you have a favourite failure?
Do I have a favourite failure? Oh, that's a good question. That's a really good one. Well done, whoever asked that. Okay. I think, yes. So one of the things that we did in the early stages of the business where it was quite difficult to get traction in beauty because the brands didn't want to come on board and customers didn't want to shop from us unless we had the brands. So we decided to diversify into fashion accessories, like handbags and scarves and jewelry and that kind of thing. Thinking that, okay, well, like those suppliers were actually much easier to come by. They, were much less defensive about their brand equity, I guess, and it didn't have to be such a big conversation. You could just approach them and say, hey, I want to buy some of your handbags. They'd be like, okay, cool. How many do you want? And so we thought, oh, well, maybe that would work. And as it turned out, what it was a massive distraction. It was a market I didn't really understand. I'd always been kind of fashion impaired. So I was sort of dependent on other people for their advice over what they thought would sell. It was a huge amount of work because your entire product selection needed to change like every 3 months seasonally. And it just took our eye off beauty, which was the thing that we were really passionate about, and that was our actual vision. And we got distracted, and we probably continued with that for maybe 3 or 4 years. And in the end, it was like when we decided to call it and close it off, it was probably a quarter of our revenue. Wow. And so it was a big decision to shut it down. But in the end, like refocusing on what the actual core vision of the business was and what we were really passionate about, excellent decision.
I never knew that. That's amazing.
There you go.
There you go. Thank you.
The importance of being focused on what problem are you actually trying to solve, and who is your customer and what do they want from you.
And not getting tempted by that adjacent revenue or whatever it might be.
Distracted by shiny things, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Kate, there's so many lovely comments going into the sidebar about your level of honesty and how much you're sharing, and lots of hard relates and lolling going on. So I'm going to take that as a good.
Oh, good.
Thank you so much for having this chat and for everything that you do for all the founders in the whole ecosystem, and the example that you set for so many women founders particularly, and just for being an awesome person.
Oh, pleasure. Back at you.